The night Karen Langley shattered my ribs. My husband whispered, "Act like you care." So I did. I smiled for the neighbors, hid the bruises under a silk blouse, and kept typing the quarterly HOA audit report as if nothing had happened. What they didn't know was that the very memo she forced me to finish that night was the one that would systematically dismantle her presidency, her reputation, and every last dime she had stolen from Pine Haven Estates. My name is Clara Voss. I'm 33 years old and my job is to find the rot. As a compliance specialist for a regional property management firm in Dallas, I spend my days sifting through digital ledgers and expense reports, hunting for the quiet, insidious patterns that signal a breach. I live and breathe the sterile logic of spreadsheets, the unambiguous language of regulations. My world is one of order, of rules that, when followed, create a predictable and safe ecosystem. It's a fiction I cling to, especially when I'm at home in Pine Haven Estates, the picture-perfect gated community that looks like a magazine cover but feels like a police state run by one woman. That night the house was silent except for the soft hum of the central air and the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. I was working from my small home office, a converted guest room that still smelled faintly of my grandmother's lavender sachets. On my screen was a memo that had become my obsession for the past 72 hours. It was addressed to the Pine Haven HOA Audit Committee. A dry, factual account of significant expense discrepancies originating from the president's discretionary fund. Falsified vendor invoices from shell landscaping companies. Lavish personal trips to Cabo coded as community outreach retreats. Dinners at $400 per plate steakhouses disguised as board strategy sessions for committees that didn't exist. Each line item was a nail, and I was meticulously hammering them into a coffin of evidence. The work was consuming, precise. I had cross-referenced everything: bank transfers, IP addresses from which invoices were submitted, even the GPS data from the HOA golf cart Karen used like her personal limo. It was a beautiful, ugly tapestry of neighborhood greed, and I was just adding the final threads in the periphery of my dual monitors. The little red icon for the HOA Zoom meeting software was still active. I'd forgotten to close it after the emergency board call earlier that evening. It blinked patiently, a tiny forgotten eye in the corner of my digital world. Its recording function still engaged from the session. The first sound that broke my concentration was the violent crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. It was Karen's white Escalade. She wasn't supposed to be here. HOA rules strictly prohibited unannounced visits after 8 p.m. A familiar cold dread coiled in my stomach. I heard the car door slam with enough force to rattle the windows. Then the front door was thrown open, crashing against the interior wall. Heavy, purposeful footsteps stomped through the house, each one a tremor of impending enforcement. My fingers froze over the keyboard. My breath caught in my chest. I should have closed the laptop. I should have run. But the memo wasn't finished. The data was all there, but the narrative, the part that connected the dots for the other board members who didn't have time to read footnotes, was only halfway complete. The door to my office flew open. Karen Langley stood there, framed in the doorway, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair somehow still flawless despite the rage twisting her face. She was a tall, rail-thin woman in her late 50s, dressed in the official HOA uniform of pastel cardigan and pearl necklace, but tonight the pearls looked like tiny nooses. The smell of her signature Chardonnay rolled off her in waves. Her eyes, sharp and icy blue, were fixed on me, burning with a righteous, entitled fury. "Still playing with your little numbers, Clara?" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous drawl. She took a staggering step into the room, clutching a heavy crystal tumbler half full of white wine. "Think you're so much smarter than everyone else? Smarter than the board? Smarter than me?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation she had been leveling at me for the 2 years since my husband Mark had gotten her elected president. My education, my job, My quiet refusal to kiss the HOA ring. Karen saw it all as a personal judgment on her divine right to rule Pine Haven. Karen, I'm just finishing some work, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. It was a skill I had perfected, the placating monotone calm of a bomb disposal expert. Any inflection, any hint of fear or defiance, would be the spark. Work, she spat the word like it was poison. You sit in here all night clicking away on that goddamn machine, looking down on the rest of us, looking down on the community that pays for your precious little house. She took another step, and my entire body tensed. My focus narrowed to the laptop. It was my life's work, my escape, and now my only weapon. You think I don't know what you're doing? She screamed, her voice cracking. You think I'm stupid? Before I could answer, she hurled the glass. I flinched, turning my head as it shattered against the wall just behind my shoulder. A spray of Chardonnay and sharp glittering shards rained down on my desk, some skittering across the keyboard. The acrid smell of the wine was overpowering. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my body was paralyzed by a cold, calculating part of my brain. The memo. The blinking red light. My hands, acting of their own accord, dropped back to the keyboard. She saw the movement. It was defiance to her. My commitment to the work in that moment was the ultimate insult. She closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. Her shadow fell over me. I tried to shield the laptop with my body, curling over it as her hand grabbed a fistful of my hair, yanking my head back. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded at the base of my skull. I'm talking to you, she roared, her other hand slapping hard across my face. My head snapped to the side and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. She let go of my hair and I slumped forward, my cheek stinging, my vision swimming, but my hands remained on the laptop, my fingers trembling but resolute, typing another sentence. These unauthorized expenditures were consistently approved using a duplicated signature stamp of the former treasurer. I practiced that. She hit me again, this time a closed fist to my side. A sharp, searing agony shot through my ribs, stealing my breath. I gasped, a ragged wet sound. I felt something crack. The pain was immense, a white-hot fire spreading through my torso. But my focus remained laser-sharp on the screen, on the words, on the blinking red dot. The recorder was capturing the sound of my choked breaths, her slurred curses, the sickening thud of her fist against my body. It was then that my husband Mark appeared. He stood in the doorway, a ghost in his golf polo, his hands fluttering at his sides. He was trembling, his face a mask of fear, not for me, but for the woman who held the keys to his precious social standing in Pine Haven. He saw the shattered glass, my hunched form, Karen standing over me, her chest heaving. He didn't scream. He didn't run to me. He didn't tell her to stop. He just looked at me, his eyes pleading, and whispered the words that would become the anthem of my revenge. Act like you care, Clara, he said, his voice a fragile thread of sound. She's just upset. Don't provoke her. The words hit me harder than any of her blows. It was the ultimate betrayal in his world. Karen's comfort was paramount, her anger a storm to be weathered, and my pain was just an inconvenience, provocation. The thin, frayed cord of hope I'd held onto, that one day he would see, that one day he would choose me, snapped. A profound, chilling calm settled over me. The pain in my ribs was a distant signal from a body that was no longer entirely mine. It was just a machine, and its function was to finish the task. I bit down hard on my lower lip, the sharp pain helping to focus my mind. Blood trickled from my nose, a warm, viscous drop that fell onto the keyboard, landing directly on the H key. I watched it for a second, a tiny crimson blemish on the clean white plastic. Then my finger pressed down, smearing it as I continued to type. Every grunt from Karen. Every whispered plea from my husband to just be nice. Every ragged gasp I took as my ribs screamed in protest. It was all being funneled into the digital ether, becoming metadata, evidence. She finally seemed to run out of steam. Her rage, like a fire, had consumed its fuel and was now collapsing into embers. She gave me one last shove, sending my chair rolling back into the wall. She stood there panting, looking down at me with a sort of dull, confused contempt. "Clean this mess up," she muttered, gesturing vaguely at the shattered glass before turning and lumbering out of the room. My husband lingered for a second, his eyes filled with a wretched mix of pity and reproach before he scurried after her. The house fell silent again, except for my own shallow, painful breathing. I sat there for a long moment, the world a blurry watercolor of pain and adrenaline. Slowly, carefully, I moved the mouse. My hand was shaking, but my movements were precise. I navigated the cursor to the top of the screen. I clicked File, then Save. A dialog box appeared. I typed the file name, each keystroke a declaration of war, Pine Haven Q4 Expense Reconciliation, Internal Review. Docs. It was the perfect camouflage. A boring HOA title for a document that now held the sound of a woman's soul rotting in real time. No one who saw that file name in a directory would ever guess its contents. They wouldn't know that embedded within the sterile lines about financial malfeasance was a high-fidelity audio recording of a violent assault. A testament to her brutality. They wouldn't know that the evidence of her embezzlement was now inextricably linked to the evidence of her personal crimes. She had forced me to finish the memo that would ruin her, and in the process she had handed me the one piece of evidence no one could ever refute. Her own voice, caught in the act of trying to break me. The morning was an exercise in careful construction. Each movement was deliberate, a negotiation with the searing pain that radiated from my ribs. Breathing was the worst. Every inhale was a sharp reminder, a stiletto sliding between the bones. I stood before the mirror in the pale pre-dawn light and surveyed the damage. A blooming, ugly purple bruise was spreading across my cheekbone, and a darker one was forming along my jaw. My lip was split, physical evidence. But in the world I inhabited, the world outside this house, this kind of evidence meant nothing without a narrative no one wanted to hear. So I built a new one. I started with a layer of color-correcting concealer, a thick pastel-like compound that felt like clay on my skin. Then came the foundation, blended meticulously to erase the battlefield of the night before. I chose my armor for the day, a crisp, high-collared silk blouse in a muted shade of pewter. It was professional, elegant, and most importantly, it covered the faint finger-shaped marks on my neck. I styled my hair to fall strategically over the side of my face. By the time I was finished, Clara Voss, the competent and unflappable compliance specialist, was looking back at me from the mirror. The other woman, the one who had bled on her keyboard, was locked away, deep inside. The final touch was the smile, a slight pleasant curve of the lips that didn't reach the eyes. It was the most important piece of the disguise. I left the house before either of them were awake. The drive to my client's office downtown was a blur of Dallas morning traffic. I kept the radio off. The silence in the car, a sterile environment in which to process. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel anger. I felt a strange and hollow clarity, the kind that comes after a high fever breaks. The world seemed sharper, its colors more saturated, its dangers more defined. The office was an immediate immersion into a different reality. The hushed climate-controlled air, the scent of expensive coffee and photocopier toner, the low industrious hum of hundreds of people making property management empires function. It was a world of rules, of processes, of predictable inputs and outputs. It was the world I was good at. "Rough night?" my colleague Mark from accounting asked as I passed his cubicle. He gestured to my coffee cup. "That's your second one, and it's not even 9. Just migraines, I said, deploying the smile. You know how it is with the pressure changes. Tell me about it, he sympathized, already turning back to his screen. See? Easy. People only see the surface you present to them. My practiced lie was more comfortable for everyone than the jagged, complicated truth. I settled at my desk, the panoramic view of the city from the 28th floor doing nothing to soothe the knot in my stomach. I went through the motions of starting my day, logging in, checking my calendar, sorting my inbox into folders of priority. It was all autopilot, a sequence of muscle memory that allowed my mind to race elsewhere. And then I saw it. An email from the Pine Haven HOA secretary, flagged as high importance, sent to all residents. The subject line was innocuous. Community announcement, new board leadership structure. My heart gave a painful lurch against my bruised ribs. Karen had announced her restructuring plan just last week. It was her department, her discretionary fund, that I was investigating. Her signature stamp that had been used on the fraudulent invoices. I clicked open the email. My eyes scanned the corporate-sounding HOA jargon. Pleased to announce wealth of experience seamless transition before they landed on the new title. Karen Langley, Executive President with expanded oversight authority. The name vibrated on the screen. The air in my lungs turned to ice. For a moment, the entire office seemed to disappear. The ambient hum faded to a deafening silence, and the only sound was the frantic, panicked drumming of my own heart. She wasn't just my neighborhood bully anymore. She wasn't just the woman who lived 3 doors down and terrorized everyone with citations. She was here. She had breached the walls of my sanctuary. The crime scene I was meticulously documenting from the outside. The lead perpetrator had just been handed the keys to the entire community and put in charge of the investigation. She was coming here to bury the evidence. And I was the first piece of evidence she would need to bury. A cold sweat broke out on my brow. My mind reeled, connecting the dots with sickening speed. The sudden resignation of the previous treasurer. Karen's intimate knowledge of every bank account from her years as president. She hadn't just been re-elected. She had orchestrated this. The fraud I was uncovering wasn't just opportunistic greed. It was likely her own scheme executed through puppet board members. And now the puppet strings were in her hands alone. My hands, slick with sweat, found their way to my mouse. I navigated through my secure drive. My movements jerky and imprecise. I needed to see it. I needed to hear it. I pulled on my noise-canceling headphones, a bulky Bose set that enveloped my ears and plunged me into a world of manufactured silence. In the encrypted folder where I kept my active case files, I found the document Pine Haven Q4 Expense Reconciliation, internal review.docs. I didn't open the Word file. Instead, I launched the audio editing software I sometimes use to review recorded depositions. I imported the file and the program extracted the hidden audio track. A long flat line appeared on the screen representing the silence of my work, and then, about 2/3 of the way through, it erupted into a jagged, chaotic mountain range of sound waves. I pressed play. Her voice filled my head, amplified and terrifyingly clear. Think you're so much smarter than me? The slurred venom, the barely controlled rage. It was all there. I heard the shattering glass, the sound so sharp and precise that I flinched in my chair. I heard my own choked gasp as she hit me, a sound more animal than human. I heard the sickening dull thud as her fist connected with my ribs, followed by her grunting exertion, and then threaded through the violence. The most damning voice of all, my husband's. Act like you care, Clara. She's just upset. I listened to the entire 3-minute recording. Every threat, every curse, every whimper. It was a perfect, pristine, time-stamped record of her barbarism. When it was over, I sat in the profound silence of my headphones, the placid professional rhythm of the office completely oblivious around me. And in that silence, A single lucid thought rose to the surface of my mind, as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. If I stay silent, I will die. It wouldn't be a quick death. She would do it slowly. She would discredit me in the neighborhood Facebook group, paint me as the crazy complainer, unstable. She would use her new power as executive president to have me fined into bankruptcy. And at home, with my husband as her willing accomplice, the harassment would escalate until there was nothing left of me to fight back. She would erase me professionally and personally. If I speak, she will. The audio file was not just evidence of assault. It was captured within a document investigating HOA embezzlement. The two were now fused, inseparable. To reveal one was to reveal the other. The memo was a suicide pact, and she had been the one to sign both our names. The binary nature of the choice settled me. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This was a compliance problem. There was a vulnerability in the system, and it needed to be patched. Karen was the vulnerability. My trembling hands grew steady. I removed my headphones. I opened the document, the text file this time. Its dry HOA language a stark contrast to the brutal audio it contained. I clicked File, then Print, one copy. I walked to the massive industrial printer at the center of our department. The machine whirred to life, spitting out the 12 pages of my report. The paper felt warm and heavy in my hands, substantial and real. Back at my desk, I didn't staple it. I slid the pages into a crisp, clean manila folder. On the tab, I wrote in neat black block letters, Q4 Vendor Audit. I placed it in the middle of a stack of other legitimate audit files on my desk. It was hidden in plain sight, camouflaged by the very bureaucracy she was planning to exploit. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time I noticed my hands were shaking again. But it was different now. This wasn't the tremor of fear. It was the low, powerful hum of a machine coming online. It was the vibration of a plan beginning to form, complex, multi-step procedure for rooting out a cancer. I didn't need to match her violence. I didn't need to scream or fight or even raise my voice. Her world was one of brute force and intimidation. My world was one of documentation, process, and protocol. And I was going to destroy her from within it. My revenge wouldn't be a messy, emotional confrontation. It would be a quiet, meticulously executed audit. All it required was the right documentation submitted to the right place at precisely the right time. Karen's official restructuring announcement was a masterclass in neighborhood theater. She convened a mandatory town hall Zoom for all 312 residents, complete with her face filling the screen in perfect lighting and a background of the community pool she had just renovated with HOA funds. She stood there beaming a 100-watt artificial smile. She wore an impeccably tailored pastel blazer, a stark contrast to the wine-soaked tyrant from my living room. She was a different woman, or rather the same woman in a more expensive costume. "I know this transition feels sudden," she began, her voice a smooth, confident soprano that rumbled with false sincerity. "But I want you all to know that my door is always open. I believe in transparency, synergy, and a forward-thinking approach. Above all, I want you to think of us not just as neighbors, but as a family. We're all in this together." I sat in my darkened office, a cold cup of coffee growing warm in my hand, my face arranged into a mask of polite neutrality. Family. The word hung in the air, grotesque and obscene. I thought of my husband's whispered plea, of the crack of my own ribs. This woman used the word family the way a parasite uses camouflage, a way to lower the defenses of her host before feeding. The rest of the residents typed polite applause emojis in the chat. I simply watched, my mind a cold, silent vault, comparing this polished performance to the raw audio file stored on my encrypted drive. Later that afternoon, her new executive assistant, her daughter-in-law, summoned me via text. "Karen's office," was the HOA clubhouse on the hill, a corner suite with a view that stretched all the way to the golf course. It was the old treasurer's space, but Karen had already begun to infest it with her own personality. A set of crystal wine decanters sat on the sideboard. She was sitting behind a massive oak desk, looking for all the world like she'd been born there. She didn't tell me to sit. "Clara," she said, not looking up from a file on her desk. She said my name with a chilling familiarity, a reminder that our relationship extended beyond these hallowed HOA walls. "This memo you prepared for the audit committee." She slid the printed copy across the desk. It was the original version, the one I had finished with her wine on my keyboard. It was covered in red ink, her slashes and circles angry and decisive. "It's good work," she said, a statement that was also a dismissal. "Thorough. A little too thorough. Maybe you flagged some legacy accounting practices that, while unconventional, are perfectly normal during a board transition. It reads as alarmist. Could create friction." She finally looked up, her eyes pinning me. There was no trace of the drunken monster, only a cold, calculating executive. This was somehow more terrifying. "I need you to revise it," she ordered. "Clean it up. Focus on the top-line efficiencies and shove the granular invoice-level data for a future review. We don't want to spook the residents with what are essentially minor reconciliation artifacts." She was telling me to bury my own investigation, to take my meticulously constructed case and strip it for parts, leaving only a hollowed-out shell that praised the very fund she was actively looting. She was testing me, asserting her new dominance. "Of course, Karen," I said, my voice betraying nothing. "I'll get right on it. Do you have a deadline in mind?" "Yesterday," she said, smiling faintly. It wasn't a joke. I took the marked-up document and walked back to my car. My spine ramrod straight. The entire walk was a performance. I could feel the eyes of the neighbors on me, the whispers already starting. The new executive president is already meeting with compliance. I sat down at my home desk and began to do exactly as she asked. It was an act of malicious compliance. I created a new document, Pine Haven Q4 Expense Reconciliation, Internal Review V2, President Approved .docs. Into this version, I dutifully transcribed her changes. I removed the damning sections about shell corporations, rephrased the paragraphs about executive travel, and reframed the $187,000 in missing funds as unallocated community enhancement overhead pending strategic reassignment. I turned a prosecutorial indictment into a neighborhood white paper. It was a masterpiece of collaborative fiction. But for every change I made in the sanitized version, I added a corresponding detailed annotation in the original file, which I now renamed Pine Haven Master Audit Complete Evidence Package .docs. This master file, with the pristine audio recording still nestled in its metadata. I saved it to 3 separate locations. An encrypted USB drive I kept in my wallet, a personal cloud storage account under a false name, and a sandbox partition on my local machine that was invisible to the HOA's shared drive crawlers. I was creating a digital Horcrux. She could destroy the version she saw, but the soul of the evidence was immortal and scattered. Then my real work began. The trap needed to be set not with a single dramatic flourish, but with a series of quiet, bureaucratic, and utterly deniable actions. I couldn't just leak the memo. That would be traced back to me in minutes. I had to make the memo a part of the system. I had to make the HOA itself discover it. I opened my email. My first target was Jim from the landscaping committee. Jim was a stickler for process, a man who lived and died by the flowchart. I attached the master file, the one with the audio, to a new email. Subject: New File Transfer Protocol Test. Urgent. Hi Jim. We're rolling out a new server-side integrity scanner to prevent data corruption on large document transfers. Could you do me a favor and download the attached file and let me know if you receive any error flags? It's just a dummy document from a Q3 audit. Need to confirm the protocol is stable before end of day. Thanks, Clara. It was perfect HOA nonsense. Plausible, boring, and with a hint of urgency. Jim replied within 5 minutes. No flags on my end, Clara. Looks good. He never would have opened the file. He did his part, confirmed the protocol, and moved on. But what he had really done was create an immutable server log showing that Pine Haven Master Audit, complete evidence package.docs, had been transferred and successfully received by the head of landscaping on this date. At this time, he was my first unwitting witness. I did the same for 3 other mid-level board members in different committees: accounts payable, vendor management, and events planning. Each time I used a slightly different but equally plausible excuse. Each download, each transfer was another thread in the web I was weaving, another breadcrumb in the digital trail that led away from me and into the very heart of the HOA's daily operations. They thought they were helping with an IT test. In reality, they were authenticating my evidence. While Karen was busy manipulating the community's finances, I was manipulating its audit trail. She was playing checkers, moving her money around the board with brute force. I was playing chess, positioning my pieces on a much larger, more complex board, preparing for a checkmate that was still 10 moves away. My phone buzzed on my desk. A text message. It was my husband. Clara, Karen told me she gave you a big new project. I'm so glad you two are working together now. Please don't make things difficult. She takes care of the neighborhood. Don't ruin this. I stared at the message, at the words, she takes care of the neighborhood. The phrase was a cage he had built for himself and was now trying to lock me inside. The delusion was breathtaking. She wasn't taking care of anyone. She was financing her life with stolen dues, and he was the terrified, complicit beneficiary. The anger I felt was cold and sharp, like dry ice. There was no point in arguing, no point in explaining. You can't reason with someone who has chosen their prison. My thumbs moved over the screen. My reply short and precise. Mark, you should start saving. I hit send without a moment's hesitation. It was not a threat. It was a piece of sound financial advice. It was also a declaration that I was severing the tow line. His ship was tied to hers, and I was watching them both sail directly into a hurricane I was helping to create. I turned back to my monitor. Karen was treating Pine Haven like her own personal ATM, a limitless source of cash accessible with a few clever keystrokes and a lot of bluster. She thought she was the only one with the key. But I was the one who had built the bank. I wrote the compliance code. I designed the security protocols. I knew where every silent alarm was, every hidden camera, every trip wire in the system. She was the bank robber, but I was the architect of the vault, and she had no idea I was about to change the combination. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, not as a dramatic phone call, but in the coldly efficient manner of neighborhood warfare, a calendar invitation from the HOA's outside counsel, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was Pine Haven's general counsel, a woman with a reputation for surgical precision and zero tolerance for ambiguity. The meeting title was simply Expense Report Queries. There were no other attendees listed besides me and her. The adrenaline that surged through me was not fear, but the sharp electric hum of a high-voltage line being switched on. The game was beginning. I spent the next hour preparing my performance. I walked into the legal department's conference room on the clubhouse's top floor, looking exactly as I was supposed to, competent, but slightly harried. I carried a binder filled with printouts, a prop to make me look like I was trying to corral a confusing mess of data. My face was a carefully constructed mask of professional concern. Eleanor Vance sat at the head of a long polished table that reflected the Dallas skyline like a dark mirror. She was in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Clara, "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "I've been reviewing the preliminary summaries from internal audit, and I'm seeing a pattern of duplicate expense filings originating from the president's office. They're small, but frequent. Can you walk me through your analysis?" This was my cue. I feigned a moment of mild confusion, opening my binder and shuffling through papers as if searching for the right page. "Yes, of course, Eleanor," I began, my voice pitched to sound earnest and slightly overwhelmed. "It's a complex data set. The issue seems to stem from a legacy software integration problem. When the previous treasurer left, some of her automated expense approvals seem to have gotten stuck in a loop, creating ghost entries. I've been trying to reconcile them, but the data is noisy." I projected a spreadsheet onto the large screen. It was data, but it was curated data. It showed the problem clearly enough to be alarming, but was messy enough to support my narrative of a technical glitch rather than methodical fraud. I was giving her the smoke, but carefully hiding the location of the fire. "Ms. Langley is aware of this?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "Yes," I said, looking her directly in the eye. This was a critical lie wrapped in a layer of truth. "She's been personally directing the cleanup effort. She asked me to consolidate my findings into a revised memo that frames this as a systems issue to avoid any undue alarm with the residents." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. A lawyer like her would instantly recognize the language of damage control. A president personally directing a compliance cleanup was a red flag. "I see," she said slowly. "Please submit that revised memo to my office by the end of the day. I want a complete record of your findings and the president's directives." "Of course," I said, gathering my binder with a display of dutiful relief. I walked back to my car, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my hands were perfectly steady. My first objective was complete. I had planted the seed of doubt and established a legitimate reason for submitting a report. I opened my email and formally attached the document. Karen had personally edited the sanitized, declawed version of my investigation, Pine Haven Q4 expense reconciliation, internal review V2, president approved .docs. I sent it to Eleanor Vance, copying her junior counsel. A public act of perfect documented obedience. That night, I waited until the clubhouse was a ghost town. The vast floor plan dotted with only a few diligent souls working late under the glow of their monitors. The cleaning crew was making its quiet rounds. In the anonymity of the near-empty building, I navigated to Pine Haven's official whistleblower portal. It was a third-party ethics platform intentionally designed to be sterile and uninviting. A digital confessional booth that promised anonymity. Most residents thought it was a black hole. They believed submissions were vetted by the board and quietly buried. But I had helped write the compliance protocol for it. I knew that any submission flagged as a critical financial integrity risk was automatically placed in a 14-day digital escrow. Its contents hidden from all internal administrators. At the end of 14 days, if not formally resolved and closed by a specific compliance officer, my role, it was automatically and irreversibly escalated to the entire External Audit Committee and the lead independent director of the state HOA Oversight Board. I opened the submission form. In the anonymous text box, I typed a simple, chilling message to the Audit Committee. A significant and ongoing scheme of financial fraud is being perpetrated and concealed by Executive President Karen Langley. Evidence of both the financial crimes and a coordinated cover-up is contained in the attached master file. This file also contains metadata proving severe ethical and personal misconduct that constitutes a major liability for this association. Escalate immediately. Then I clicked Attach File. I selected Pine Haven Master Audit, Complete Evidence Package .docs. The file with everything, the original unedited data, my annotations, and the pristine high-fidelity audio recording of my assault. I watched the progress bar fill. When it was complete, I clicked Submit. A small green check mark appeared on the screen. It was done. The clock was ticking. The next 14 days were the longest of my life. I lived in a state of suspended animation, a surreal performance of suburban normalcy. I attended block parties, filed reports, made small talk by the community mailboxes. I was a ghost at my own front door, my body going through the motions while my mind was constantly counting down the days, the hours, the minutes. I was a model resident, quiet, diligent, and utterly unremarkable. I built a wall of boring bureaucratic routine around myself, the perfect camouflage. Karen, however, was beginning to unravel. Her confidence was eroding, replaced by annoying paranoia. She started making excuses to walk by my house multiple times a day, just touching base on those Q4 projections. She'd say, though her eyes would be scanning my windows. Everything going smoothly with the system's reconciliation? She'd ask, her tone just a little too casual. She was a predator, sensing that the terrain under her feet had changed, that a trap had been set, but she couldn't see the wires. Her anxiety was a small, satisfying reward for my own strained nerves. On day 12, with just 48 hours left on the escrow clock, she abandoned all pretense. She stormed over to my house when no one else was around, leaning over me at the mailbox. Her voice a low, menacing whisper. "That report for Eleanor Vance," she hissed. "Did you send it?" I didn't flinch. I looked up at her, my expression one of mild surprise mixed with professional deference. This was the moment. I had rehearsed it in my mind 1,000 times. Not the final version. "No," I said calmly, turning my body slightly so she could see my laptop screen through the window. "It's a sensitive document, Karen. Given your direct involvement, I wanted you to give it a final look over before it was officially logged into the legal archive. I wouldn't want to misrepresent your directives." The appeal to her ego, to her desperate need for control, worked perfectly. Relief washed over her face, quickly replaced by her usual arrogance. "Good. Smart," she grunted. "Pull it up now." I swiveled my monitor to face her. On the screen was the icon for the sanitized file, the one she had edited, Pine Haven Q4 Expense Reconciliation, Internal Review V2, President Approved. Docs. "This is it right here," I said. She didn't ask me to open it. She reached past me, her expensive cardigan sleeve brushing my shoulder, and took my mouse. Her hand, the same one that had struck my face, confidently enveloped the small plastic device. She moved the cursor over the icon and clicked. Double-clicked. The sound of the clicks was sharp, definitive. In the quiet office, the document opened, its contents exactly what she expected to see. A neutered, harmless report. But I wasn't watching the document. I was watching the lower right corner of my screen where the HOA's mandatory IT security software was humming along silently. I knew that every action taken on my workstation was logged. When she, a user with executive president-level credentials, accessed a file on my machine, the system created an indelible record. User K. Langley, Executive President accessed file path Pine Haven Q4 Expense Reconciliation. Internal Review V2. President Approved. Docs on workstation comply. 078 at 15:42 and 17 seconds Central Standard Time. She was digitally signing the confession. She was creating irrefutable proof that she had seen and approved the doctored evidence before it was sent to legal. She was no longer just the woman behind the fraud. She was now the woman in charge of the cover-up with her own digital fingerprint all over the weapon. She scanned the document for a moment, nodded in satisfaction, and pushed the monitor back toward me. "Fine," she said. "Send it." She walked away, her posture confident again, convinced she had once more dominated the situation and averted a crisis. I watched her retreat, her broad back disappearing into her Escalade. I felt no joy, No anger, not even triumph. All I felt was the cold, clean satisfaction of a complex piece of machinery operating exactly as designed. I swiveled back to my desk and whispered to the empty air, "You just signed your own warrant, Karen." The 14-day clock on the whistleblower submission was set to expire on a Wednesday. By the preceding Friday, the atmosphere at Pine Haven had begun to curdle. Whispers travel faster than emails in a gated community. A rumor once released into the ecosystem of cul-de-sacs and backyard barbecues mutates and spreads with viral efficiency. Started small. A junior board member mentioning to a neighbor that Eleanor Vance was looking into some accounting irregularities. The neighbor mentioned it to her friend during a coffee walk. The friend mentioned it to her husband at the pool. By Friday afternoon, the entire neighborhood was humming with a low-grade anxious buzz. The phrase "internal investigation" was being spoken in hushed tones, a suburban curse that could bring ruin upon anyone in its blast radius. Karen felt the shift immediately. Her manufactured bonhomie evaporated, replaced by a tense, brittle-edged paranoia. Her open-door policy at the clubhouse was now perpetually closed. Her walks through the neighborhood were no longer glad-handing tours but grim, sweeping patrols. Her eyes scanning for clusters of whispering residents. The pressure building at the HOA sought a release valve, and as always, that valve was at home. The house, which had once been a place of quiet dread, now became a tinderbox. The evenings were thick with a suffocating tension. Karen would pace the sidewalk in front of our house, her phone in her hand, her face illuminated by the screen's cold glow. She drank more, her movements growing heavier, her temper fraying over the smallest things, the height of my rose bushes, the color of my welcome mat, the way I placed my trash cans on the curb. My husband in turn became a frantic peacekeeper, his anxiety manifesting as a desperate, fluttering energy. He would follow her around, trying to soothe her, offering her another glass of wine, another compliment, his voice a constant, placating murmur. He looked at me with accusing eyes, as if the storm clouds gathering over Karen's head were of my making. The eruption came on Sunday night, the end of the weekend, with the full weight of the coming board meeting pressing down. I was in my room packing a small discreet duffel bag with a change of clothes, my personal laptop, and a hard drive. It was a go bag, a contingency I had prepared for this very moment. I was planning to leave quietly the next morning and stay at a hotel until the 14 days were up. My husband burst into the room without knocking. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a frantic fear. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his gaze fixing on the bag. "I was just organizing some things." I lied, my voice even. "Don't lie to me, Clara," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and panic. "Karen is falling apart. The things people are saying in the group chat. It's because of you. It's that report. You're doing this to her. You are destroying this neighborhood." The accusation, so profoundly unjust, so completely inverted from the reality of our lives, struck a nerve deep inside me, a nerve I thought had long since died. A raw, hot anger, an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years, surged through me. I stood up from the bed, my movements sharp and sudden. "I'm destroying this neighborhood," I said, my voice low and shaking with a fury that surprised even me. "This isn't a neighborhood, Mark. It's a hostage situation with better landscaping. You want to talk about destroying things? Let's talk about the woman who is drinking herself into a rage on our sidewalk right now. Mark, she doesn't just find me. She's stealing. She's a common thief in a $300 cardigan. She is looting this community, the same one that pays for our house, for your golf membership, for every comfortable thing in your life, and she is going to get caught. That is a fact. It has nothing to do with me." His face hardened, the fear replaced by a wall of rigid denial. He couldn't hear it. He wouldn't hear it. To acknowledge that she was a criminal would be to acknowledge that his entire social life was built on a foundation of lies and stolen dues. It would mean that his choice to stand by her and not by me was not just a moral failure, but a catastrophic strategic error. She is a good woman who is under a lot of pressure, he shrieked, his hands balling into fists. You've always been jealous of her, of me, of what we have, what you don't have. I laughed. A sharp, bitter, humorless sound. You have a monster who uses you as a shield and me as a punching bag. You just can't see it because you're terrified of losing the country club invites. That's enough, Clara. The words were punctuated by the sharp, stinging crack of his hand across my face. It wasn't a powerful blow, not like hers, but it was infinitely more shocking. The force of it snapped my head to the side. For a long second, the world went silent. There was only the ringing in my ears and the hot, stinging imprint of his palm on my cheek. I slowly turned my head back to look at him. I didn't touch my face. I just stared into his eyes, searching for a flicker of remorse, of love, of anything that looked like the man I remembered from a lifetime ago. But there was nothing. His eyes were not the eyes of a husband who had just struck his wife. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, wild with terror. He wasn't looking at his wife. He was looking at the person who was about to burn down his comfortable, well-appointed cage. In that moment, I saw with a final heartbreaking clarity that he was lost. She had already destroyed him. I took a step back from him, a physical act of creating a distance that had been growing between us emotionally for years. I felt no anger now, only a profound and empty sorrow. The final illusion had shattered. My silence, my stillness seemed to unnerve him more than my shouting had. He stared at me, his chest heaving before turning and fleeing the room. The sound of our argument had, of course, drawn her out. A few moments later, Karen filled the doorway. Her face was dark with fury, her eyes bloodshot. She had heard everything. You ungrateful little bitch, she snarled. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on my personal laptop, sitting open on the small desk in the corner. It was a symbol of my independence, my connection to a world outside her control. With a roar of incoherent rage, she lunged across the room, grabbed it, and raised it high above her head. You and this goddamn machine, she yelled, and she hurled it to the floor. It hit the hardwood with a sickening crunch of cracking plastic and shattering glass. The screen spiderwebbed into 1,000 pieces. She wasn't done. She stomped on it once, twice, her designer loafer crushing the keyboard, grinding the delicate internal components into dust. She stood over the wreckage, breathing heavily, her chest puffed out, a conquering tyrant who had just vanquished her enemy. She looked at me, expecting to see tears, fear, devastation. She saw nothing. I stood perfectly still, my expression unreadable. I just watched her. I let her have her tantrum, this pathetic physical display of power that meant absolutely nothing. She could smash the plastic and silicon. She could break the screen, but she couldn't touch the data. She couldn't erase the files. As she stood there panting over the corpse of my computer, I knew with absolute certainty that every important document, every photo, every piece of my digital life was safely backed up, synced in real time to a server 1,000 miles away, completely and forever beyond her reach. She was fighting a ghost. She had already lost. She stared at me for a long moment, her rage deflating into confusion at my lack of reaction. Finally, she just grunted and stormed out of the room. I didn't even look at the destroyed laptop. I zipped up my duffel bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked out of the room. I walked down the stairs, past the living room where my husband was now sobbing quietly, his face in his hands. I didn't say a word. I walked out the front door and did not look back. I drove until I found a small anonymous apartment complex 20 miles away, the kind with month-to-month leases and transient residents. I paid for the first month in cash. The unit was small and smelled of fresh paint and industrial carpet cleaner. It was furnished with cheap, impersonal furniture. It was the safest I had felt in 2 years. I took out my phone, popped out the SIM card, and snapped it in half. The next morning I bought a cheap burner phone and a new number. I was a ghost. That night, for the first time since Karen had taken over my life, I slept. It was a deep, dreamless, and profound sleep. There were no nightmares, no waking up in a cold sweat. For the first time, I felt the silence not as an absence of noise, but as the presence of peace. And in the deepest, quietest part of that peace, as I slept in my empty, sterile apartment, I felt like I could hear a distant sound, a rhythmic, steady marching. It was the sound of consequences, the sound of a woman walking, step by inevitable step toward the reckoning she had built for herself, the sound of retribution, finally on its way. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks and a lifetime after I had walked out of my husband's house. It was from the office of the HOA Oversight Board Chair, Marcus Thorne. The subject was mandatory attendance, special meeting of the Audit Committee. The body of the email was stark and simple, listing a time and a location. Clubhouse Boardroom A, 2 p.m. My name was on the invite listed under technical support. The time had come. Boardroom A was Pine Haven's inner sanctum. It was a cold, imposing room, dominated by a massive boat-shaped table of polished granite that felt as heavy and permanent as a tombstone. One entire wall was a sheet of glass offering a godlike panoramic view of the neighborhood, a silent testament to the power of the people who sat at the table. The air was chilled to an uncomfortable degree, and the silence was so profound it seemed to have a physical weight. I was brought in 15 minutes early by a tight-lipped junior lawyer from Eleanor Vance's team. He showed me to a small console at the side of the room. Just be ready to project when asked. Ms. Voss, was all he said before retreating. I was a piece of equipment, a human peripheral, and that was exactly the role I intended to play. I sat, my back straight, my hands resting on my company-issued laptop, and I waited. The members of the committee filed in one by one. Marcus Thorne, the oversight chair, a man whose calm demeanor belied a famously ruthless regulatory acumen. Eleanor Vance, the general counsel, her face an unreadable intelligent mask. 2 external board members, a retired banking executive and a stern-faced woman who ran a logistics empire. They took their seats, their movements economical and deliberate. They did not make small talk. Then Karen arrived. She walked in with a display of confident, slightly beleaguered professionalism. She carried a leather-bound portfolio and nodded to the board members, a faint, collegial smile on her face. She looked every inch the capable executive, ready to tackle a tedious but necessary bit of community housekeeping. She did not look at me. To her, I was part of the furniture. She took her seat at the table directly opposite the chair. "Thank you all for making time on such short notice," Marcus Thorne began, his voice calm and authoritative. "We are here to address a significant anomaly flagged by our automated ethics and compliance platform, which was subsequently escalated to this committee as per association protocol. Karen, we need to discuss an expenditure from your discretionary fund totaling $187,000, categorized as specialized community maintenance supplies." Karen's expression didn't flicker. She opened her portfolio, projecting an air of complete, unruffled competence. "Of course, Marcus," she said, her tone smooth and reasonable. "I'm glad we're addressing this. There's been some confusion, and I take full responsibility for not communicating the context more clearly to the auditing teams." She launched into a brilliant, obfuscating monologue, a cloud of HOA jargon so thick it was almost poetic. She spoke of synergizing legacy assets, proactive infrastructure amortization, and specialized non-standard procurement channels required for time-sensitive repairs. She presented a narrative in which she was a decisive leader, cutting through red tape to solve a critical problem, and the $187,000 was a necessary, if unconventionally documented, expenditure. It was a masterful performance. She was almost believable. The invoices themselves are admittedly complex, Karen continued, turning a page in her portfolio. They were processed through a third-party vendor who specializes in rapid acquisition, which is why they don't fit our standard template. Frankly, I think this whole situation highlights a process failure within our own internal controls. And then came the pivot. The moment she laid the first stone of her own tomb. The compliance department, with all due respect, is designed to handle routine expenditures, she said, a note of condescending patience in her voice. They're not equipped to vet this kind of high-dynamic procurement. My office submitted the paperwork, and it was compliance's job to flag any procedural issues. The fact that it escalated to this level suggests the ball was dropped. The paperwork sat on their desk, and instead of seeking clarification, they allowed it to become this misunderstanding. She didn't say my name, but every head at the table turned slightly, their gazes flicking toward me, the quiet woman sitting by the wall. I had been designated the scapegoat. Marcus Thorne looked at me. "Vas," he said, his voice neutral. "You were the compliance specialist assigned to this review. What is your assessment?" This was it. I stood, walked to the head of the table, and connected my laptop to the presentation system. My movements were calm, methodical. I wasn't a frightened victim or a vengeful resident. I was a technician. My initial assessment is detailed in the preliminary memo filed with the General Counsel's office, I said, my voice clear and steady. However, that file was a revised version based on Ms. Langley's direct input. For a full technical analysis, we would need to review the original master file. Then let's see the master file, Thorne said. Karen stiffened slightly in her chair. A flicker of unease crossed her face. She thought I was bluffing, trying to save my own skin by referencing a document she assumed was either deleted or buried. On the massive screen that took up half the wall, my desktop appeared. I navigated to the secure folder. I moved the cursor over the file name Pine Haven Master Audit, Complete Evidence Package. Docs. It looked so boring, so harmless. I double-clicked. The document opened. A dense wall of text and numbers. The room was silent. The only sound the soft hum of the projector. The board members leaned forward, their eyes scanning the screen. For a few seconds, it was just another audit, another spreadsheet. And then I scrolled to the bottom of the document and clicked a small embedded icon that looked like a paperclip. I had set the audio file to play automatically upon being opened. The first sound that erupted from the room's high-fidelity speakers was the sharp, violent shattering of glass. The effect was shocking, visceral. One of the board members physically flinched. Karen's face went white. Then came her voice. Not the smooth, controlled soprano of the executive, but the slurred, raging growl of the monster. "Think you're so much smarter than me?" The raw, entitled fury of it filled the sterile boardroom. A primal scream in a cathedral of cul-de-sacs. I heard my own choked gasp, a sound of pure animal fear, then the sickening wet thud of a fist hitting flesh. The board members were frozen, their faces a mixture of confusion and horror. Eleanor Vance's expression was stone. Marcus Thorne's hands were flat on the table, his knuckles white. Karen looked like she had been turned to stone. Her mouth was slightly open, her skin a pasty grayish color. Her eyes were wide, darting from the screen to the faces around the table, seeing only her own reflection in their shocked expressions. And then the final damning line of audio, her voice cutting through the noise, a clear and sober command amidst the chaos. "Delete that, you stupid girl." The words hung in the air, an explicit order to tamper with the very evidence they were now reviewing. It was the bridge that connected the two crimes, the personal and the financial, fusing them into one undeniable act of corruption and depravity. Absolute silence descended upon the room. The audio file finished. The only sound was the faint whisper of the air conditioning. Every single person at that table, every titan of suburban governance, every powerful lawyer, slowly turned their head and stared at Karen Langley. She was no longer a colleague. She was a specimen, a piece of filth pinned under a microscope. I disconnected my laptop. The screen went black. I looked at the assembled faces, my own expression perfectly neutral. The meeting software we use for remote compliance reviews has an auto-record function that is enabled by default, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. Each word a carefully polished stone dropped into a deep still well. This was recorded automatically during the finalization of the document. It was the truth and it was also my shield. I wasn't the accuser. The association's own protocol was the accuser. I was merely the technician who had pressed play. Marcus Thorne, the oversight chair, looked at Karen, his eyes as cold and hard as the granite table between them. He slowly picked up his expensive Mont Blanc pen, looked at it for a moment, and then set it down with a quiet final click. "This meeting is adjourned," he said. His words were not a dismissal. They were a verdict, a death sentence for a presidency. Karen didn't move. She just sat there, impaled by the stares of the entire room. She finally turned her head and looked at me, and for the very first time, I saw it. It wasn't anger. It wasn't contempt. It was pure, undiluted fear. It was the terror of a predator who has suddenly realized she has stalked her prey directly into the center of a perfectly constructed steel trap. She was looking at me, but she was no longer seeing her neighbor or a subordinate resident. She was seeing the architect of her own destruction, and she was terrified. The explosion was not immediate. It began as a tremor, a carefully worded press release issued by the Pine Haven HOA board after the community Facebook group had gone to bed. It was a masterpiece of legal ease, mentioning an internal review of financial controls and the board's decision to place Executive President Karen Langley on indefinite administrative leave. The statement was designed to be calming, to suggest a routine procedural matter. It failed spectacularly. By the next morning, the tremor had become an earthquake. The local news, smelling blood in the water, tore the story wide open. It was the lead headline on every neighborhood next-door feed and the Dallas morning shows. Pine Haven HOA president sidelined amid internal fraud investigation. The Dallas Morning News had a more damning take. Sources allege significant misconduct at upscale community. Whistleblower complaint at center of probe. Property values in Pine Haven dropped 12% in pre-market listings. The beast of public opinion had been awakened and it was hungry. My own email inbox contained a sterile formal notification from the HOA secretary citing the ongoing internal and now external investigations. I was also being placed on paid administrative leave effective immediately. It was not a thank you. It was a quarantine. I was the star witness, the patient zero of this neighborhood pandemic, and they needed me isolated. My access to HOA systems severed while their army of lawyers attempted to contain the outbreak. I was to have no contact with any Pine Haven residents. I was an unperson, a ghost on the dues roster. I packed up the few personal items I kept at my anonymous apartment and settled in for the siege. The first call came that afternoon. It was an unknown number, but I knew who it would be. I answered and was met not with a greeting but with a raw, ragged scream of pure anguish. It was my husband. "What did you do?" he shrieked, his voice a tearing, hysterical sound. "It's everywhere, Clara. Her picture is on the news. They're calling her a criminal. They're destroying her. You did this. I stood by the window of my small apartment, looking down at the indifferent traffic flowing on the street below. I felt a strange and distant calm, the calm of an astronomer watching a distant star collapse into a black hole. The event was violent and catastrophic, but it was too far away to touch me. "She's not leaving her clubhouse," he sobbed, his words devolving into a frantic, incoherent ramble. "She just sits there. She won't talk. You've ruined us. You've killed her." The accusation, once the most powerful weapon in his arsenal, now felt pathetic. It was a child's tantrum in the face of an avalanche. "No," I said, my voice quiet, devoid of anger or pity. It was simply a statement of fact. "She did it to herself." "You ungrateful monster," he wailed. "After everything she's done for us. Goodbye, Mark," I said, and I ended the call. Then, with a few simple taps on the screen, I blocked his number. It was not a dramatic act. It felt like a simple, necessary piece of personal maintenance, like deleting spam from an inbox. The line had been cut. The days that followed were a blur of legal and financial news. The initial HOA press release gave way to a flood of official actions. The Texas HOA Regulatory Commission announced a formal inquiry. The district attorney's office subpoenaed Pine Haven for all financial records related to Karen's tenure. Forensic accountants, the quiet bloodhounds of white-collar crime, descended on the clubhouse. For Karen, the collapse was swift and total. Her administrative leave became a termination for cause. Pine Haven's lawyers, in a move of brutal self-preservation, handed over every piece of evidence they had to the investigators. They gave them the sanitized memo she had forced me to write. They gave them the IT logs showing she had personally accessed and approved it. They gave them the master file from the whistleblower portal. The pieces of my trap, so carefully laid, were now being used by the authorities to build her cage. The final nail in her coffin was the most mundane bank records. The forensic accountants traced the $187,000 for maintenance supplies through a series of shell corporations, the same ones I had identified in my memo, to a final destination. A private bank in the Caymans, a bank account in the name of Karen Langley. My digital evidence was now corroborated by undeniable financial reality. A grand jury was convened. Less than a month after that disastrous board meeting, Karen Langley was formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. My role in all of this was quiet and procedural. I spent 2 long days in a sterile conference room at the DA's office with a team of prosecutors, walking them through the memo, line by line. I explained the data. I authenticated the audio recording. I answered their questions in a calm, even monotone. I was not a victim seeking justice. I was a compliance specialist explaining a breach. The culmination of this process was a single document, a formal witness affidavit, a 20-page summary of my testimony. A prosecutor slid it across the table to me. "Read it carefully, Ms. Voss," he said. "Then, if it is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge, sign at the bottom of each page." I read it. It was my story, my work, translated into the dense, heartless language of the law. I picked up the heavy black pen. My signature, usually a quick, fluid script, felt slow and deliberate. With each stroke, I was codifying the truth, turning my trauma and my methodical revenge into an official historical record. When I signed the final page, I pushed the document back across the table. It was done. The weapon had been fired, and it had hit its mark. I walked out of the granite fortress of the courthouse into the bright, unforgiving Texas sun. I had expected to feel something. Relief, perhaps vindication, even a grim sense of triumph. I felt nothing. There was only a profound and unsettling emptiness. For months, my entire existence had been focused on this one singular goal, the meticulous, Systematic destruction of Karen Langley. It had been the engine that drove me, the cold, clear purpose that got me out of bed in the morning. Now it was over. The engine had fallen silent, and I was adrift in the quiet that remained. The war was won, but I had no idea what to do with the peace. That night, back in the sterile silence of my apartment, the emptiness was unbearable. I needed to understand it. I needed to go back to the beginning. I opened my laptop and navigated to the encrypted file, the audio recording. I didn't want to hear her voice. I didn't want to hear the sounds of the violence. I scrubbed through the chaotic sound waves on the screen until I found what I was looking for. A small, quiet valley in the jagged mountain range of noise. A moment just before the final blows. I pressed play and I heard my husband's voice, a fragile, desperate whisper that had set everything in motion. "Act like you care, Clara." I listened to the line again and again. "Act like you care." And then something inside me broke. A sound bubbled up from my chest. A strange, unfamiliar sound that I didn't recognize at first. It was a laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy or humor. It was a raw, cathartic, and slightly unhinged laugh of pure, undiluted irony. It was the laugh of a prisoner who realizes the key to her cell has been in her hand the entire time. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. He had begged me to act, to perform a role for her benefit, to pretend to care about the woman who was breaking my body and spirit. He thought that was the only way to survive. The laughter subsided, leaving me breathless, tears streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of liberation. I leaned back, a real, genuine smile spreading across my face for the first time in years. I spoke the words out loud to the empty room, a final, definitive answer to that whispered plea. Care? Oh, I did. Just not for her. With Karen's indictment secured and the media firestorm beginning to die down into glowing embers, I received an email that was in its own way as obscene as my husband's accusations. It was from Pine Haven's chief human resources officer, a man named David Sterling, whose signature block was longer than the email's actual content. Subject: Appreciation. Dear Clara, on behalf of the entire Pine Haven leadership team, I want to extend our sincere gratitude for your courage and transparency during what has been a challenging period for the association. Your commitment to our core values of integrity and accountability is a testament to the character of our residents. We are now moving forward with a renewed focus on a culture of compliance and are confident that the community will emerge from this stronger than ever. We wish you well during your continued leave. Sincerely, David Sterling, CHRO, Pine Haven HOA. I read the email twice. It was a perfectly crafted piece of corporate nothingness. They thanked me for my courage as if I'd run a marathon for charity, not handed them the evidence that saved the neighborhood from complete implosion. They praised my commitment to their core values, which they had until very recently allowed Karen to trample all over. The email wasn't for me. It was for their lawyers. It was a document to be entered into a file, a box to be checked, proving the association had officially appreciated the whistleblower. The paid leave stretched from weeks into a month. Then, too, the world moved on. Karen was out on bail, awaiting a trial that was months away. Pine Haven property values had stabilized. A new permanent president had been hired, a blandly competent woman from an outside firm brought in to signal a fresh start. And I existed in a strange HOA limbo, cashing dues refunds from an association that refused to speak to me. My polite weekly emails to the secretary inquiring about a timeline for my return were met with increasingly vague and delayed responses. Finally, I forced the issue, requesting a formal call to discuss my residency status. David Sterling himself got on the line, his voice as smooth and synthetic as the polished plastic of the phone. Clara, good to connect. He began with the false warmth of a funeral director. Listen, as you can imagine, The events of the last few months have prompted a significant strategic review of our internal structures. We're taking this as an opportunity to realign our departmental synergies and reassess headcount across the board. I listened silently to the waterfall of HOA euphemisms. He used the word restructure 5 times. He spoke of right-sizing the organization and optimizing our human capital. I knew exactly what he was saying. So you're eliminating my residency privileges, I said, cutting through the jargon. Not at all, he replied, a little too quickly. We're simply evolving the role, and in the interest of a clean slate for everyone, we've put together a generous transitional package for you. It includes a significant severance payment and full benefits for 12 months. Of course, it would be contingent on the signing of a standard non-disclosure agreement. There it was, the go away quietly money. They weren't evicting me. That would look like retaliation and invite a lawsuit. They were offering to pay me to disappear. In the HOA narrative, Pine Haven was frantically trying to write me out. I was as much of a liability as Karen had been. She was the disease, but I was a living, breathing symptom, a reminder of the sickness they wanted everyone to forget. I was the star of a show they were desperate to close. I see, I said. Thank you, David. I'll need some time to consider the offer. Of course, he said, dripping with relief. Take all the time you need. I hung up the phone. I wasn't angry. The cold, clear logic of the situation was almost beautiful in its cynicism. I had been a tool, a very effective one. And now that the job was done, the tool was being put back in the box, a very expensive NDA line box. The next day, I made my final trip to the Pine Haven clubhouse. I had arranged with security to collect my personal belongings. My access card had already been deactivated. I was an outsider, an invited guest in a community where I had once been a vital part of the immune system. The walk through the main hall was a strange, disembodying experience. People who once sought my advice on complex regulatory matters now stared intently at their screens as I passed or offered tight, pitying smiles. I was a ghost haunting the scene of the crime, and my presence made everyone uncomfortable. At my old desk in the compliance office, a cardboard box was waiting for me. I began to methodically pack my life away. A coffee mug with a chipped rim, a dying succulent I'd forgotten to water, a framed photo of me and my grandmother. It didn't take long before I sealed the box. I sat down at the computer. A temporary login password had been left for me on a sticky note. I typed it in. I didn't look at old emails or files. I had one objective. I inserted a small, new, completely clean USB drive into the port. I navigated to the single file that had started it all. The one I had left on the system for the investigators, Pine Haven Master Audit, Complete Evidence Package. Docs. The evidence. I copied it to the USB drive. Then I initiated a secure wipe protocol, a piece of software that overwrites a file's data 35 times before deleting it, making it utterly unrecoverable. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. When it was finished, the file was gone from their servers forever. The original evidence, the true and complete record of what had happened, now existed in only one place, the small piece of plastic and metal in my hand. It no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. I sealed the box, placed it on my chair for the mailroom to collect, and walked toward the elevators. But I didn't go down. I went up. I rode the silent express elevator to the executive wing. I walked across the plush sound-dampening carpet to the office of the oversight chair, Marcus Thorne's executive assistant, a woman named Brenda, who had been with him for 20 years and was said to possess more institutional power than most of the vice presidents, looked up as I approached. Her expression was perfectly neutral. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Brenda," I said, my voice calm and pleasant. "I was just clearing out my desk. I have something for Marcus. Would you mind making sure it gets to him personally?" I placed a small, plain white envelope on her desk. It was light, felt almost empty. She looked at it, then back at me, her eyes searching for a clue. I gave her none. I simply smiled, turned, and walked away. Inside the envelope was the USB drive, and inside the USB drive was the master file with its pristine audio of fraud and violence. Wrapped around the drive was a small note folded in half. On it, I had written 7 words, "You owe me my home or your license." It wasn't blackmail. It was a statement of fact, a professional courtesy. Marcus Thorne was a certified public accountant. He held a professional license that was contingent upon ethical conduct. As oversight chair, he had a fiduciary duty to the residents. His attempt to quietly bury me, the key witness in a massive fraud case, could be construed by the state commission as concealing a material fact, could be seen as witness tampering, could cost him his license, his career, everything. The USB drive in his hand was the proof of my story. He now had a choice to make. I spent the next 2 days in silence. I didn't answer calls. I didn't check the news. I just waited. The call came on the 3rd morning. It was not David Sterling from HR. It was Eleanor Vance. Her voice was as crisp and devoid of emotion as it had been in the boardroom. There was no apology, no preamble. "Clara," she said, "the board has approved the restructuring of the Global Compliance Division. The position of department head has been created to oversee all compliance and ethics operations, reporting directly to my office. We would like to offer it to you. It wasn't just my residency. It was a promotion, a massive one. It was a seat at the table. It was power. It was everything I had just demanded." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, a quiet assertion of my new position. "Thank you, Eleanor," I said finally, my voice perfectly even. "I'll think about it." I ended the call and I did think about it. I sat in my quiet, empty apartment, the offer hanging in the air like a question. And as I thought about their offer, I opened my new laptop and started drafting a business plan. I was thinking about my next move. I never accepted the offer from Pine Haven. To go back would have been to step back into the cage, no matter how gilded they made it. My revenge was never about getting a corner office in the clubhouse. It was about dismantling the system that protected women like Karen. So I declined politely but firmly and cashed the 6 months of severance they offered me in a desperate final attempt to buy my silence. I used the money to hire a lawyer and incorporate my new company. The story of the Pine Haven scandal had a longer tail than I expected. In the staid world of suburban governance, it was a drama of almost Shakespearean proportions, complete with a villain, a victim, and a satisfying brutal downfall. My name, once buried in compliance reports, was now attached to the story. I was the whistleblower, the key witness. To some, I was a hero. To others, I was a community Judas. To myself, I was simply a survivor who had kept good records. 6 months later, after Karen had been convicted and was awaiting sentencing, I was invited to appear on a major local news network. The segment was part of a series called The Bottom Line, hosted by a famously sharp journalist named Julian Croft. The official topic was women, ethics, and the new era of community transparency. It was a sanitized, media-friendly title for what I knew it would really be an attempt to get me to cry on television. The studio was an icebox, the air so cold it felt brittle. The lights were blindingly hot, creating a strange sensory contradiction that seemed designed to keep you off balance. A makeup artist had spent 20 minutes layering foundation on my face, creating a smooth, flawless mask that felt as artificial as Karen's boardroom smile. I sat in a sleek, uncomfortable chair opposite Julianne. She was all sharp angles and sharper intelligence, her eyes holding a predatory gleam. She saw stories not as human experiences but as assets to be mined for ratings. The interview started predictably. We discussed the importance of robust internal controls, the role of compliance departments, the need for boards to take ethics complaints seriously. I gave her the clean, professional answers. I was calm, articulate, and slightly boring. I could see a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. I wasn't giving her the drama she wanted. Then, halfway through the segment, she leaned forward, her expression shifting from journalistic inquiry to intimate, almost conspiratorial sympathy. It was a calculated move designed to disarm me. "Clara," she said, her voice dropping to a softer, more serious tone. "You've spoken so eloquently about the professional side of this, but the court documents, which are now a matter of public record, allude to a personal dimension to this story. They paint a picture of profound betrayal and personal injury." I remained perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap. I did not take the bait. She pressed on. "There are millions of people watching this. People who may be in situations where they feel powerless, trapped by people who hold power over them, professionally or personally. If you could say just one thing right now to the woman who hurt you so deeply, what would it be?" There it was. The question designed to break me. She wanted tears. She wanted a soundbite of a victim's rage or a victim's pain. She wanted a woman scorned. The cameras tightened on my face. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath. I could feel the weight of millions of viewers all leaning in, waiting for the emotional payoff. I looked away from Julianne. I looked directly into the dark, unblinking lens of the main camera. I thought of Karen, not the broken woman in a courtroom pantsuit, but the raging monster in my office. I thought of her fists, her voice, her absolute certainty that she could break me. And then I thought of the one thing I had taken from that experience. The one lesson that had saved my life. My voice when I spoke was not emotional. It was not angry. It was as calm and clear as a piece of ice. She taught me how to document. The silence in the studio was absolute. It was a physical thing, a sudden vacuum that sucked all the air out of the room. I saw the camera operator flinch. I saw Julianne Croft for the first time in her storied career, rendered completely speechless. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The carefully constructed narrative of her segment had been derailed. I had refused to play the part of the victim. I had just defined myself as a student who had learned a valuable, if brutal, lesson. Before she could recover, I continued, my gaze still locked on the camera, speaking now to the audience she had invoked. Powerlessness thrives in silence and in the absence of proof. The most powerful tool anyone in a vulnerable position has is the record. A clear, factual, and unimpeachable record. I had their attention. Now I wasn't talking about my pain. I was offering a strategy. The problem is that for most people, documenting is not safe. It's not easy, and they fear, rightly, that their evidence will be dismissed or used against them. That's the system I'm building a solution for. Julianne had found her voice again, scrambling to get the interview back on her track. A solution? What do you mean? I'm the founder of a startup called Ethic Line, I said, seizing control of the interview. We're developing a secure, decentralized platform for residents to report community misconduct. It's not just a submission portal. It's an evidence-building tool. We're using AI to analyze communications, emails, group chats, calendar invites for patterns of coercion, harassment, and fraud. The platform automatically timestamps and encrypts suspicious interactions, creating a secure, legally sound chain of custody for the user in real time. It provides anonymous access to legal resources. It's a silent digital witness that works for the resident, not for the association. I laid out the entire business plan right there on local television. I talked about the market, the technology, the mission. I transformed from a whistleblower into a tech founder, from a witness into a visionary. I was no longer the subject of the story. I was the author of the next one. The segment ended as the crew began breaking down the set. A frantic producer ran up to Julianne, handing her a phone. Julianne listened for a moment, her eyes wide, then walked over to me. "That was my executive producer," she said, her professional mask back in place, but her eyes showing a new grudging respect. A man named Alistair Finch was watching the broadcast. He's the senior partner at Finch Venture Capital. He wants to know if you'd be willing to take a meeting with him tomorrow. The investment came 2 weeks later. $2.4 million in seed funding. The term sheet was signed in a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the Dallas skyline. As I signed the contract that gave birth to Ethic Line, I felt a sense of rightness, of a circle closing. Karen was eventually sentenced to 12 years in a federal prison. Her name became a cautionary tale in HOA management courses. My husband never called me again after I blocked his number. I heard through a distant relative that he had moved to Florida, trying to escape the shadow of the name Voss. They were ghosts now, specters from a life that no longer belonged to me. My new life is one of long days and longer nights, of building a team, of coding, of pitching to new investors. It's a world of keyboards and screens, just like before. And sometimes late at night when the office is quiet and the only sound is the soft click-clack of my own typing, I can still hear that whisper in the back of my mind, an echo from a haunted room. "Act like you care." And I smile to myself, my fingers never pausing, and I whisper back to the ghost, "Now I act." Mark. 2 years passed. 2 years of 18-hour days of caffeine and code of building something from nothing. Ethic Line was no longer just a business plan I had sketched out in a moment of defiant clarity. It was a real thriving entity. We had a team of 20 brilliant, dedicated people. Our software was in beta testing with 3 Fortune 500 property management companies. We were making a tangible difference, creating the shield I never had for people I would never meet. My life was my work, and for the first time it felt like my own. The past had become a distant country. I rarely thought of Karen or my husband. They were historical data points, the origin story of the person I had become. But they held no active emotional power. Karen was a number in the Federal Bureau of Prisons inmate locator system. My husband was a ghost I had chosen to exorcise. The scars on my ribs had long since faded to pale silvery lines, and the one on my neck was a faint, barely there memory that only I could find. The notification arrived on a Tuesday morning, not with a bang, but with the quiet electronic chime of an incoming email. I was in my office, a minimalist space with a glass wall overlooking our open-plan workspace, reviewing a quarterly budget projection. The email was from the automated notification system of the U.S. Attorney's Office, a service I had signed up for as a registered victim in a federal case. The subject line was stark. Stripped of all sentiment. Update regarding inmate 7340827 I clicked it open. The message was just a few lines of bureaucratic text composed by a machine for a machine. This email is to inform you that the status of Karen J. Langley, inmate 7340827, has been updated as of 4:37 Central Standard Time. Status: deceased. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. This is an automated notification. Do not reply to this email. I read the words, deceased cardiac arrest. I read them again. They were just data input. I felt my own heart beating a steady calm rhythm in my chest. I felt the warmth of the coffee mug in my hands. I heard the distant murmur of my team collaborating in the main office. The world did not stop. The tectonic plates of my life did not shift. There was no surge of joy, no wave of grief, no tremor of vindication. There was nothing. It was simply the final entry in a long-closed ledger. Project had reached its end state. The variable had been nullified. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm. I stared at my monitor, not at the email, but past it at the screensaver that was now gently cycling on the screen. It was the Ethic Line logo, a stylized E that also formed a shield. Beneath it, our company motto slowly faded in and out of view. Transparency begins where fear ends. It was the thesis statement for my new life. It was the promise we were selling to the world. It was the truth I had forged in the fire of my old one. Fear had not ended for me when she was locked away. It had ended the moment I chose to document. The moment I decided my own record of the truth was more powerful than her violence. Her death was not the end of fear. It was just a postscript. My fingers moved, acting on an impulse I hadn't consciously formed. I closed the email notification, dragging it into the trash without a second thought. I opened my personal encrypted cloud drive. I navigated through a series of nested password-protected folders until I found it. The file that had started everything, Pine Haven Master Audit, Complete Evidence Package. Docs. I hesitated for only a second, my cursor hovering over the icon. Opening this file was like visiting a grave, but it was a grave I had dug, and I was no longer afraid of the ghost that was buried there. I double-clicked. The document opened. The dense, familiar text. The neatly organized columns of fraudulent expenses. The precise damning language I had typed with bruised ribs and a bleeding lip. It was a perfect crystalline fossil of my own terror. I looked at the words, and I felt a profound sense of distance, as if I were a historian studying an artifact from a lost and brutal civilization. I could appreciate its construction. I could understand its significance, but I could no longer feel the heat of the world in which it was forged. My eyes went to the top of the page, to the subject line I had typed in a different lifetime. Subject, Pine Haven Q4 Expense Reconciliation, Internal Review. It was a lie, a piece of HOA camouflage. That was never what this document was truly about. It was time to give it its proper name. I highlighted the text. The letters turned blue. Waiting for my command. I hit the delete key. The words vanished. The line was blank. My fingers steady and sure moved over the keyboard. I typed two new words. Subject, closure. Felt right. Felt final. It was the recategorization of my own history. This file was no longer a weapon. It was no longer a piece of evidence. It was a monument to a war that was over. I moved the mouse and clicked the small purple save icon. The disk whirred for a fraction of a second. The change was made permanent. The file was closed. The cool blue-white light of the monitor illuminated my face. I caught my reflection in the dark screen. Pale ghost-like image. The light caught the faint silvery trace of the scar on my neck. A tiny imperfection on the surface of the glass. A reminder, a receipt for a price I had paid in full. Slowly, deliberately, I moved my cursor to the corner of the screen and clicked the shutdown button. The digital world on the screen collapsed into itself. The logos and icons winking out of existence until all that was left was the profound silent black. I leaned back in my chair, the soft leather creaking in the quiet room. I looked at the blank screen, the mirror to my own quiet, contained world, and I whispered the words into the silence. A final answer to a long-dead question. A final report to an audience of one. You wanted me to act, I said. I did. The screen was black. The end.